So, welcome everyone to today's webinar on child rights and child labor risks in global supply chain. This webinar is organized by ETI Sweden together with our member Rädda Barnen and the Center for Child Rights. Short introduction of who we are, Ethical Trading Initiative Sweden. We are a multi-stakeholder initiative bringing together companies, trade unions, NGOs, and public sector to work on how we can better secure decent work and human rights in global supply chains. And we do this together with our member organizations. And that is why we have invited one of our members today, Rädda Barnen, to share their experience and knowledge of how to do this best. But first, a couple of house rules. Today's webinar will be recorded, so be aware of that. We will share the presentations afterwards with all of you. If you have any questions to the participants in the seminar, please post them in the Q&A and we'll pick them up at the end of the seminar. And of course, if there's any technical issues, don't hesitate to write them in the chat. So I'll leave the floor to our three speakers that we have with us today. We have Mark Robertson and Claus Hamilton from Save the Children. And we have Eleni Georgiopoulou from Aldi, who will be sharing her experience of working with this. But we'll start by introducing Mark Robertson, who will kick off this seminar on child rights. Mark, welcome.
Thanks so much, Henrik, and hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be on today. So we're actually going to start with we hope, with a short Menti quiz, just to get your knowledge on some questions related to today's topic, child labour, and how to address it. So hopefully you now all see on screen the first question. So that if you're not used Menti before, super easy. All you need to do, take out your smart device, go to www.menti.com, and then you enter a code that you see on screen, which is 80400743. So if you enter that code, then you should be able to answer our first question, which is approximately how many of the world's children are in child labour? Is it 1 in 250, 1 in 100, 1 in 25, or 1 in 10? I see some responses coming in, so I'll give it a few more moments. Good, a few differences. We shall reveal I'll give it a few more seconds, then I shall reveal the answer. Okay, interesting. So, oh, 1 or 2 more coming in. So actually, the answer is 1 in 10. So global estimates suggest there's around 160 million children in child labour, which is shocking enough. But particularly shocking is actually that reflects a worsening in child labour progress. So things have like recent stats produced last year showed that progress has slipped, as Claus and I will explain a bit more today. So, and also that was even pre-COVID, and we know that COVID will have had worse impacts. So a few people got that right, but yeah, let's move on to the next question, which is, where is the most common context where child labour occurs? Or if you like, which industry sectors do you think it's most often found in? Is it manufacturing, agriculture, mining, or services? Okay. A few more seconds. Okay. Right, so most of you got that right. It is indeed agriculture where most child labour cases are found. followed by services, and then other sectors, including manufacturing. So well done, and you're correct in your responses to that answer. Finally then, what's the lowest age when a person would be allowed to work? Is it 13, 15, or 18 years of age? Okay, nice spread of responses coming in. Okay, so actually the answer is 13, and there's quite a number of countries around the world where you can legally work at 13. The issue, of course, being the type of work, and as we'll explain a bit more today, it's very important when children enter the workforce at a lower age that they're not exposed to hazardous work risks, which we'll expand a bit more today. But thanks, hopefully that's whetted your appetite a bit for the topic today. Thanks so much for your responses. And we'll now switch back to the main presentation. Just give me a second to show my screen. Okay. Moments. Okay, so hopefully you see my screen okay. Excellent. With that then, Claus, I will hand over to you.
Yes, so thank you, Mark. So before I go into some sort of background definitions and an overview of child labor today globally, which we touched upon now in the Menti, but we'll expand a little bit upon. I should probably introduce myself. So hi everyone, my name is Claus Hamilton. I work as an advisor with Save the Children, with what we call our Child Rights and Business Global Hub that works on putting child rights onto sort of the business and human rights agenda and integrating it into policies and steers, etc., and the outcomes of that agenda, and try to influence it with a child rights perspective. We work quite closely together with Mark, who will introduce himself more also in detail, and the entity that he works from, which is the Center for Child Rights and Business, that works quite practically with companies, specifically in supply chains, on these issues. So I will start by giving you an overview of child labor, its definitions. So we have that in the background as we pursue this webinar, and then sort of the latest on the estimates, what we're seeing, developments, what are risk areas, etc. So Mark, if you can go one slide, and we'll just have this in the background as we start understanding child labor a little bit more. You probably recognize many of these frameworks that are on your screen. So when we talk about child labor, we talk about quite common definitions about what it is. It is quite often in practice a bit more complicated to understand child labor than it is when we see it defined. But you have the ILO core conventions on minimum age and worst forms of child labor that you probably, many of you working in this space know, and you're referring to them in your code of conduct and policies, for example, that defines what child labor is in terms of ages and tasks, and what the expectations are on governments in order to tackle child labor, etc. We also have in the Conventions of the Rights of the Child an article to end child labor, and that children have the right not to be in child labor. And we also, as a global community, in the Sustainable Development Goals, target 8.7, we have a joint ambition to eliminate child labor in all its forms by 2025, which is quite soon, honestly. We only have a few years, and as Mark alluded a little bit to, we do have some challenges when it comes to the situation of child labor, as we've seen some reverse in progress as of late, but we'll get more into that. More on the sort of how and how this links to businesses. Not all child labor is of concern of global supply chains. Global supply chains passes through some of these areas where we know children are at risk of having to be involved in child labor, meaning that it's also a business risk and a concern of you in order for you to sort of be part of the movement in trying to ensure that children's rights are fulfilled globally and also in relation to your business operation. And you probably know, and Mark, I think Mark will also talk more about this. So the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, for example, that tells us how governments and businesses are supposed to handle human rights challenges, child rights challenges, for example, and child labor across their value chains and in relation to their business partnerships. And then we also have the children's rights and business principles that put children's rights onto this map, which is a set of principles that support companies to see how and where they interact with children, and in that case can then sort of understand better how they should include and integrate child rights into their human rights diligence. So next slide, please, Mark. Just to sort of clarify beyond just speaking about frameworks and conventions, what child labor is more specifically, it can be understood from sort of two separate axes or two separate definitions. So not all child work is necessarily child labor. In accordance with the convention, every individual below the age of 18 is considered to be a child, but not everyone in a working situation between the age of 18 is necessarily in child labor, which makes things a bit more complicated. But also in some instances, for example, work for a 16-year-old can be good if it's decent and if it supports their development in order to sort of fulfill their full potential and thrive as a young adult. So when to understand child labor, we have these two sort of definitions to look at. So one is if at the workplace itself, sort of the working situation, if that is mentally, physically, socially, or morally harmful to a child, then it's considered to be child labor, and it's considered to be hazardous child labor. This applies to everyone below the age of 18. So there are certain circumstances for those that are eligible to actually work to be fulfilled in order to ensure that the working situation is decent and not harmful to a child. The second one that we most often think around, I think, which is where we sort of think around the ages, is actually connected to what is taken away from a child who is in a child labor situation. So if it interferes or deprives the child from the right to access or acquire a good quality education, then it's also considered to be child labor. And this is where we look most often at the ages. So it's codified most often because you do have the right to go to school. In Sweden, for example, we have something called skolplikt, which is up until the age of 15. So if I am not able to attend that school, if I am too tired because I have been up working, or if I get injured when I go to, before I go to school, or something in the circumstances around it, I don't get enough rest, etc., that I can't acquire or go to school and have access to the school and get a quality education, then it's also child labor. So this is often then simplified by the age of 15. There are circumstances in certain countries that we call usually call development countries or development context, where this age limit is put to 14. And then there also, you're allowed to do so-called light work, which sort of constitutes to supporting a little bit with the household, the odd hour every week, which you are allowed to do if you're of a lower age. But it's quite easy to remember that the age of 15 or 14 is what we usually use to define the term child labor. And it all links back to your ability to access and acquire a good quality education. Thank you, Mark. Next slide, please. So what does it look like then today? Well, like Mark said, and linked to the Menti questions, the situation for children in general, and specifically also when we talk about child labor, is quite alarming, to be quite honest, because we're seeing a regression for the first time since you started estimating the numbers of child labor globally. So the latest estimates, they were presented last year in 2021, and maybe you saw some media coverage on this. And these are estimates that were collected in 2020, shows that approximately 9 million more children are in child labor, as opposed to the latest estimates that were presented in 2016. And this is the first time we're seeing an increase in child labor since these kind of estimates started. So that constitutes a total of 160 million children globally that are engaged in any form of child labor at any point of that year. So it doesn't mean that children are working full time all the time all through the year, but at some point during that year, they're engaged in something that you would consider being child labor. Approximately half of this work is also hazardous work, so it's directly harmful to children's physical, mental, or social development. And also, looking at these numbers, you can also see that the majority of the increase is also found in the lower age groups. So between the ages of 5 to 11 is where you see the biggest increase. That also links back to sort of the total number of increase that we're seeing. Looking at regions, you're seeing stall, but some progress in most regions, especially looking at sort of, Asia and Latin America and Caribbean. You're seeing decreasing numbers still, though it's decreasing slower. But the sort of major increase is also found in the sub-Saharan Africa region, where you see 24% of children engaged in child labor, which constitutes approximately 1 out of 4 children. And in total, like Mark said, this is about 1 in 10 children globally are engaged in child labor. I saw a question popping up on the agriculture sort of discourse, what that means. So 70% of all children are working in the rural areas and in agricultural activities. And what's quite important to understand here, and important to understand the complexity of child labor, is that we tend to think, I think, when we see child labor as an issue, that it's someone hiring someone. But it's basically, most of this work is done in the entity of a family. So it's just children helping their families to get by in their sort of day-to-day, trying to get by and acquiring their income on a day-to-day basis. So it can be the family household that works in agriculture in a smallholder setting, and you need to support during cropping season, meaning that you'll miss out on some schoolwork because you need to help and support with the crops. And then it can also be that it happens to be that you'll have to carry heavy loads, and then that will constitute some hazardous work. But it's all done within the family household, because the root cause for why you are in child labor is because you just need to help your family to get by in the daily routine. Mark, I think you can go to the next slide, please. And this is also where we need to understand child labor as something bigger than just sort of that individual in a child labor situation. There are many root causes and push factors as to why children are in child labor, and it's not necessarily created by a specific industry. It's not created, the work is not created by a specific supply chain, but it actually is just because we are in these vast net of global supply chains, and these products and services are sort of passing through areas where the risk of child labor is high and children are in need to support their families. So this also gives quite complicated answer to the question, what do we need to do to tackle child labor? And it's a concern of many areas of society. So we need to strengthen education, we need to strengthen access to social protection and social insurance schemes, strengthening child protection, for example, but also ensure decent work conditions for working parents and working youth, for example. And then look at the responsibility that we have in the global supply chains and strengthen our due diligence processes to understand this nature of child labor and how it is sort of a result of something else. So we need to understand it from a more of a child rights perspective, which I will pass on to Mark to speak more about. How do we strengthen our supply chain development work? How do we strengthen our human rights due diligence work in order to try and ensure that we're actually being part of the movement that are reversing the numbers of child labor and ensuring that children at risk of child labor can be returned into a more safe environment and schooling environment. So please, Mark, I will hand over to you to speak more on that.
Thanks so much, Claus. That's a really helpful overview of the kind of background and the context around child labour and some of the issues we need to do, the approaches we need to take to tackle it. So I'm sorry, I'm Mark Robertson. I'm Senior Vice President at the Centre for Child Rights and Business. And as Claus mentioned, we're a not-for-profit social enterprise organisation. We're actually set up by Save the Children over 11 years ago. And really our focus is to work with companies to improve their impact on child rights in their global supply chains. So we work across a number of different areas to achieve that aim. So obviously child labour prevention and remediation is a big part of our work, which we'll be talking about today, but we also do work across a broad range of other child rights areas with companies in their supply chains as well, be that promoting family-friendly workplaces at factories and farms or other work around risk assessments, etc. So that's just a very quick introduction to myself and the centre. But what I really want to do just for my part of the session today is very quickly run through the legal landscape and a bit of the context around, you know, what the obligations are in relation to child rights. And then I'm going to share some data and a bit more information around how we approach and address child labour. So as Claus has kind of already mentioned a little bit, there's obviously a growing number of different international frameworks, policy instruments, and other requirements that already require you as brands and retailers to address child labour and child rights. Obviously, there's a huge amount of focus on the UN guiding principles, but also the OECD guidelines as well, all of which create clear responsibilities for companies to both prevent and remediate child labour risks in their supply chain. And I'll talk a bit more about how in a second. But what I just want also to do is just quickly highlight, obviously, other things that no doubt you're very much aware of, which are coming our way, all of which do have components related to child labour and child rights issues. So obviously the due diligence directive that will be shortly coming out of the EU or soonish, will certainly require you as companies to identify and address child labour risks in your supply chain. That will include, obviously, not just tier 1 suppliers, but looking right down your supply chain, and also will require you to not just identify risks, but make sure that you have clear processes to address and remedy child labour. What's also interesting, though, about the EU due diligence directive is, as proposed, is that there is talk of an instrument that would allow for import bans for products that are suspected to be manufactured with human rights violations. So a bit like the US customs requirements, which have a similar important ban in place. What that might mean is if there's allegations made against products or services suspected of being made with child labour or forced labour, for example, then there's a real risk of products being impounded or prevented from import. So it will be interesting to see how things move forward, but I think certainly there's a clear groundswell of additional legal requirements that really require companies to look at this from a legal perspective. I'm not going to go through these now in the interest of time, but these are just other ones that we've flagged, which you'll be able to see as part of the slides when we finish. One other quick thing to mention, though, is just reflecting last week, which saw the conclusion of the global conference on child labour, which took place in South Africa in Durban. And during that conference, there's a call to action which has come out of the conference, which really focuses on galvanizing businesses and governments and all the stakeholders that Claus mentioned, action to accelerate action to address child labour, given the timeframes that we're working towards. And again, really, these do pick out some of the work that Claus has mentioned already, and then we'll be talking a bit more about today. But obviously, components related to decent work, addressing the worst forms of child labour and hazardous child labour, particular focus on agriculture, and then thinking as well about how issues such as child labour are linked to other challenges such as modern day slavery, etc. So definitely worth a look at the broader call to action, because there are clear asks which will no doubt stem from that in relation to businesses in your human rights due diligence process. But next up, I really want to share some of the key insights from the centre's work to address and remediate child labour cases in global supply chains. So what you see on screen is really some key insights from some of the child labour cases that the centre and our global team have worked on in different countries. The way the centre works is we have a child labour remediation process. So businesses will refer child labour cases onto us, and then as part of the remedy support, then we offer a full child labour remediation process. I'll explain a bit more about how that works in a second, but essentially that sees us doing a rapid assessment and then delivering child labour remediation in the interest of the child. And as you can see, there are hotspots that you see. This is basically looking at data from our work over the last few years, but you can see that a lot of the main manufacturing centres in Asia that no doubt form part of your supply chains are places where we're picking up child labour cases. And through the data that we collect, we're able to be quite granular in really understanding where child labour cases are occurring, why are they occurring, what are the common characteristics of those hotspots, etc. As Claus mentioned, one thing I would share is that we have really seen a worsening of child labour risks across the board, across sector, since and during COVID-19. So, and for a variety of reasons, COVID-19 really has obviously created pressures across the board for a large number of workers in supply chains, but also worsened conditions for families and those on low incomes as well. So we are seeing those effects coming through. But what I just want to share here is just some insights from what we find when we're working with international brands and retailers on child labour. So the first thing to note is that the majority of child labour cases which are referred to the centre for remediation are found in lower tiers. So that might not surprise you, but whilst we do work a lot with first tier suppliers, the vast majority, 75% of cases come from lower tiers and also from unauthorized subcontractors. So there's a clear need there, with due diligence in mind, to really think about expanding on the processes that you have to monitor risks lower down your supply chain. In terms of industries, it's mostly agriculture and the garment textile industry, but we are seeing risks increasingly emerge across different sectors that we're working with. We do work a lot with agriculture and textile companies, which is why you see a particular focus in the numbers there. But as we've mentioned already, they are also two sectors which are particularly impacted by child labour. Other insights, though, from our work is looking at how child labour cases are identified. Interestingly, when we look at that, we find that the majority of cases tend to be identified through factory visits made by your own staff. So not via audit, but actually by visits that you or your responsible sourcing colleagues might be making to factories or farms in your supply chain. And that's quite interesting, because I think people often think that audits are the main way in which we come across child labour cases, and that's actually not the case. Obviously, audits play a role, but by far it's actually your own staff visiting and being in your supply chain. What's also interesting, though, is that if we think about audits, third-party audits or external audits are far less effective at identifying child labour, which is a problem because obviously a lot of brands and retailers use third-party audit programs. But for a variety of reasons, I'll perhaps expand on in the Q&A. We do see that, you know, in most cases, the internal audits that you and your teams do are far more effective in identifying child labour cases. Other insights we see is also that announced audits tend to be ineffective in identifying child labour cases. Probably not surprising, but still an important finding when you think about your own strategy around child labour prevention remediation, and thinking about how you might need to supplement that from a due diligence perspective if you are relying on third-party announced audit programs. And if we think a bit about how the kind of nature of cases, we know that the vast majority of cases involve fake IDs, which is often how child labourers or young workers get to work in factories. Breaking down the numbers, we find that the vast majority of cases tend to involve girls in supply chain. So you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, they're 67%. And then job positions vary. So these are positions from different sectors, obviously quite a few relating to textiles. But what I really want to get across here is that the roles in which children can perform in factories can often be quite varied, but also often expose them to hazardous work. So things like lifting or using dangerous machinery or other areas of hazardous employment. We also find that the average age is around about 18, but still quite, you know, sizable chunks of cases we're working more on are involving kids who are 13 years or much younger in some instances. And a lot of the child labour cases we work on occur during the summer school holiday months as well. And that's often due to a lack of childcare support, which means that parents are kind of forced really to bring their children to work because they don't have childcare. Children are often hired by production managers, but it can really be different roles in a factory or farm, as you can see on the left-hand side. And in almost, well, not all cases, but the vast majority, it's relatives who are the ones who will refer children on to employment in a farm or a factory. So what we try to do is as part of the remediation, what we do is obviously look at how kids have got into the factory, you know, what systems have failed to enable that to happen, but also what awareness we need to create within communities to improve understanding of the importance of education and the damage that being in work can do. And that's often, you know, amongst families as well as obviously at the factory level. But just to share some insights which are interesting from, you know, how we've tracked some of the impacts of COVID-19 on child labour. So you can see the red line is cases, if you like, before the pandemic, and then the orange one is what we found during the pandemic. So this data is a little bit out of date now because it's going back to 2021. But what you do see here is probably what you'd expect. So poverty is still playing a key role as a causation factor for child labour, but lack of daycare as more people were at home and workers were forced to isolate became less of an issue because obviously there was more chance for families to be together. But what we do see though is that where there's nothing to do at home, because of school closures, for example, which of course have been widespread and still ongoing in certain countries, there is the risk of child labour increases. So, and that's obviously because, you know, children are out of school and, you know, really looking for different ways to spend their time. What we'd see, I think, if we run these numbers right now is that poverty would again start to feature more highly and some of the issues would drop back. But through the data that we're able to collect, what we try to do is really look at how and where the different causation factors around child labour play a role and how they change according to different factors, be they related to obviously the pandemic or the war in Ukraine and the effect that's having in supply chains, or other external factors as well. And from a brand perspective, it's really important that you're able to kind of think about how these different issues will come to play in your sourcing approach and the work that you're doing to address and monitor risk on an ongoing basis. But in terms of then, how to approach child labour and what that means, what we have developed at the centre is a clear process for addressing child labour risks in supply chains. And there's clear steps that we take to address child labour risk. So firstly, once we are notified of a child labour case in supply chains, then we immediately work with brands and retailers to conduct an on-site assessment. And from there, we really develop a remediation process, which starts with the best needs of the child and works back from there. So what that means practically is, in our experience, a robust child labour remediation process can see you working with the child labour cases or children for anything from a number of months up to potentially, a matter of years, depending on the context and the situation of the child. So obviously, if it's a younger child, then there's a need to provide sustained and ongoing support to make sure that the child remains out of work and doesn't, end up back in work in a matter of months, in the future. So we, working with brands and retailers, put in place, long-term plans that provide support to the child, its family, and are designed to provide sustained support. And that, will involve sometimes returning children to education. If it's safe to do so, return them to their hometowns. If that's not safe or possible, then we've looked at residential support for children as well, or indeed vocational education opportunities for older children. So the process is ongoing. It's important when you're working on child labour remediation to have consistent monitoring and reporting as well. So make sure that you are following the progress of child labour cases in your supply chain, and really understanding the needs of the child at different ages as well. So that's a quick overview of the processes that we've implemented to address child labour risks. But just to give you a very quick update or example, and this is a case that we've worked on in the last few months. Just an example of a child labourer that we've worked with. Context being that wasn't performing well at school. The child's family weren't placing a strong focus on education, and therefore this child entered into work into a factory. They've dropped out of school several times, etc. Poverty also being a factor. So what we did here is worked to encourage and build the child's interest in education, in this case vocational education, put in place an appropriate plan, working with the brand and the factory to support the child through the remainder of his education, but also working with the family to recognise the importance of education as well. So it's just a quick example, but it just gives you a sense of, what, at individual level, what strong and effective child labour remediation can look like. So just very quickly before I pass over to my colleague from Aldi, just to give you a sense of what does this look like then from a due diligence perspective. So what we have on screen is the OECD due diligence guidelines and process for managing risk in your supply chain. And what I want to just kind of give a sense here is the different steps that we suggest brands and retailers take to implement the different areas of due diligence. So obviously starting and making sure at the first stage that you have a strong process and policies and systems in place, strong code of conducts that have comprehensive requirements covering child labour. So that's about going much beyond a simple commitments to not to employ children in your supply chain, to covering a lot of the broader issues that we've talked about already today around young workers, hazardous work, etc. And really making sure that that code of conduct is communicated down your supply chain. But then it's also about looking at how you're identifying and assessing risk. So through the work we do with brands and retailers, it's a big focus of ours increasingly is on conducting child rights risk assessments. So helping you understand what the child labour risks are at the top of your supply chain, and then working down the various tiers in your supply chain to map and understand risks, which is part of the identify and assess areas. And then from there, it's about moving through to capability building and support for suppliers and making sure that's cascaded down your supply chains, having robust systems in place to ensure that you are able to track and monitor risks on an ongoing basis. But crucially, and this is where we do see a lot of gaps in corporate performance, having a strong system in place to provide remedy to cases should they be identified. So that's a quick run through the kind of broad framework. But with that, I'm actually going to stop here and pass across to Eleni so that we give time for you to share a little bit from Aldi's perspective and some of the work that you're doing on child labour. So Eleni, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. And thank you for having me. So my name is Eleni Georgiopoulou, and I'm the responsible manager for Aldi South Supplier Evaluation Program and Capacity Building Program, which is addressing salient risks such as child labor. And for those who haven't heard of us or shopped from us, a few words about Aldi South. We are an international food retailer operating in 11 countries on 4 continents, and we're employing around 170,000 staff with more than 6,700 stores around the world, which makes us, of course, a global company with a global footprint. And for that reason, we have a responsibility of creating products with sustainable manner. And we have 183 colleagues around the world doing just that and working on corporate responsibility for Aldi South, which I am a member of this big team. So this is about Aldi South. And today we would like to share a few practical examples, hopefully best practices from our side for other companies to hear and emulate at the best case. So we have started our journey by doing, I think, what most companies have been doing the past few years, which is a risk assessment. And the reason we did this was we had to look where is our highest priority commodity groups and where is the highest risk of child labor. So within our risk analysis of our entire supply chain, we looked at also particularly indexes on child labor and indexes that a lot of the legislation upcoming and current requires us to do so. So we have resulted with a scope where we know that this is our focus areas and we should be looking at implementing risk measures and projects on these commodity groups. So after having done that, prioritizing risk, we also looked at current legislation while doing the risk analysis, we looked at current legislation, we looked at upcoming legislation. Like you mentioned, Mark, there is a lot of upcoming legislation that is expecting companies to take certain measures to reduce child labor risk. So we did our gap analysis and we saw where we are lacking. And I think that's fair enough for all companies to do. Even if we have strong management systems ourselves or for our suppliers, there's always room for improvement. So that's what we did. And they helped us come up with a human rights due diligence framework that we built our strategy around. And so this framework is looking on how Aldi South can prevent, identify, remediate child labor in our supply chains. So this is the framework we started with and based all of our work and the work that we also collaborated with the center. When it comes to prevention, Of course, in order to prevent child labor from happening, you have to look at your management systems and your policies. So we launched our child labor policy in 2019, back in 2019 at our website. And then Aldi, Australia and UK followed with their own child labor policies, specific to their national legislation. And based on the policy and in order to support further our suppliers, we launched a supplier guidance paper for non-food supply chains. And essentially, this was a guide on explaining our requirements to our suppliers and helping them implement them. We are now working with the center on adjusting such guidance paper to match food supply chains, which is our focus as well. And Mark also mentioned earlier via Menti, or also in his presentation, how this is a little bit of a black box in general for the industry. There is a lot of traceability concerns, and we're trying to address them head on. So that is the work that we've done on prevention. Then identification comes next, which is also a key step. How do we identify child labor cases if they do exist in our supply chain? And that is where we do audits, of course, like all brands or all retailers around the world. However, we have a differentiation factor, which is really working well for us. We're putting focus on our suppliers. We're leveraging on our suppliers to implement our CR requirements and manage the CR component of our supply chain. And so we found this to be quite successful. And just like Mark mentioned, the internal audits are always a bigger factor for a bigger, I guess, source for the brands to have more traceable and a better understanding of their supply chain. So those internal audits of our suppliers and along with the audits that we conduct have been a great source of identifying where there are non-compliances regarding child labor. So that has been quite effective for us, but after you identify a child labor case, what do you do? And this is also where the center has been a great collaborator of ours. And whoever saw the remediation process that Mark showcases, the remediation process that we follow with the center. They are our objective on-the-ground partner that helps us remediate any child labor case identified in our supply chain. And we have made sure that there are clear responsibilities, roles and responsibilities that we've set out for our teams and the center teams. And it always puts the center's interests first. So when it comes to remediation, we have the process, and of course, we have a lot of proactive projects that we are running along with the center and other partners. We have managed to launch a child labor guidance, a child labor e-learning on the guidance paper we developed along with the center. So it visualizes our guidance papers better because, you know, the communication sometimes can be a big hindrance of all the work that you do. And we've also launched 3 child friendly spaces also along with the center. And that was a big help before and during Corona, because like Mark said, there was a big problem of parents, migrant parents not being able to leave their children at home while they had to go to work. And so that was a project that proved very interesting in times of need. And we're looking at also advancing this project forward to see which are other suppliers in need of such services. And lastly, we've also launched a virtual workshop during Corona times to China key suppliers. And that was a more in-depth follow-up on all the child labor guidance papers that we have launched in advance. So this is the work that we have done so far. This is the work that we plan to do. Some of the work that we plan to do, a lot more is coming up. So I hope that the framework at least has been helpful for everyone who's listening. It's just to summarize, a matter of setting strong management systems of prevention, identification, and remediation while collaborating with industry. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks a lot to everyone who's been speaking today. It's been an information-packed 15 minutes, and everyone who is in the audience is now welcome to write your questions in the Q&A, and we'll pass them on to the panel. We have a first question from Peter Williams. If child labor is most prevalent in the informal sector, what does that tell us about how we should do due diligence and where we should focus implementation?
I'm happy.
Who's the question for?
Yeah.
The one from one of you who feels inclined to answer. I think Mark, you can go ahead, and the rest of you can see if you have something to add to his answer.
Okay, sure. Thank you. I'll certainly start. So I think the key thing in, I mean, the question's is bang on, because as we've shared, the key risks in relation to child labour are very often further down supply chains, but also in informal sectors, and whether or not that's distributed supply chains, involving agricultural farms spread across a broad geographical area, or home working settings where, for example, in the apparel and textile sector, we see workers often working at home on fine embroidery or, on detailed garments, for example. I think the first thing really is obviously, as we've discussed, to make sure that you understand more about the role of informal work in your supply chain. So of course that comes down to transparency, and having a better understanding of risks and mechanisms to address those. So that can in part be about quite targeted risk assessment. So if you suspect or know that there's informal work in your supply chain, doing some targeted work to really understand what the nature of that risk looks like. So in a home working setting, working in home working communities, going into those communities to understand what the risks look like, what are the features of child labour, what are the features and the nature of work. But what we're also seeing is, the companies that are addressing these risks more effectively in informal sectors are those that, the ones that are succeeding, I think, are those that are more effective at setting up bottom-up communication channels and ways of addressing risk. So we've seen, for example, increasingly creating things like community facilitators, and these might be people within the community or even people who are directly employed by a brand, whose job it really is to kind of be your eyes and ears on the ground, to kind of monitor situations and feedback issues to you as they occur, and really help you also on the remediation side as well. So I think with informal sectors in mind, it's really about looking at the types of inspection that you have, increased transparency, but really seeing how you can create bottom-up networks to keep you connected to where the risks are. But I'll pass across to Claus and Elena and see if there's anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah, sorry, Elena, you want to go first? Okay, sure. I can just echo what you're saying, especially on sort of the transparency and the traceability, to understand how those lower tiers and sourcing tiers of your supply chain work, and then work on that sort of bottom up, understanding the communities, working with the communities to spread the awareness, and having them report back and support the impact that you want to create. But also, sort of on that note, what we're seeing in more of these high risk sectors as well, is that companies are seeing this more and more as a shared responsibility, and that it's easier to work together in order to tackle these issues because you actually share them, and it's not necessarily a business business unique for one actor over the other. So sort of we're also seeing companies that are collectively addressing this together in sort of cross-industry platforms. So you can have more visibility of the risk areas of a shared supply chain. So if we're looking at agriculture and you know, coffee comes from certain geographic areas, cocoa comes most often from West Africa, for example. So for those sort of that deep sourcing, you can do this in a joint venture together with other companies to get more visibility of the supply chain, learning from each other and tackling the issues together. So that's also something that we're seeing more and more coming, apart from what Mark was mentioning as well.
I'm afraid I will have to echo as well because the solutions are known. It's just difficult to implement them at times, especially in the food supply chain. So traceability, doing traceability studies, human rights impact assessment, or others would call them risk assessment, as Mark said. So just to further understand how your supply chain is structured, where is your last point of contacts or leverage, if you may say so, because that's where you can implement some projects, or that is where you can have some influence in your supply chain. And of course, something maybe that we didn't mention or alluded to it, grievance mechanisms is another strong tool that a lot of companies are taking in, into their armory to be able to build up their understanding and to be able to identify child labor in their supply chains, because you cannot remediate a case that you don't know about. So grievance mechanisms can help. And in these sort of tools, you can ask more questions about lower tiers or what is happening when it comes to the subcontracted facilities. And we are working with Amphori on a grievance mechanism project in Vietnam, and we also have some grievance mechanism tools that we are implementing, hotline, other tech tools, etc. So they are all just an effort to get more transparency at the end of the day. So yeah.
Great. We have, unfortunately, I think we might just have time for one more question, but it's a very practical question. And I think a lot of people out there are scratching their head, thinking about how to go about this, because most of us are relying on third-party audits. We don't have the possibility to have that presence everywhere. So what can be done to make third-party audits more effective to find child labor cases, as many of us are need to use them to have that reach?
Yeah, may I start with this one, if you don't mind? Just because I'm the responsible manager, as I mentioned earlier, for the supplier evaluation program, and I also touched upon during my presentation that we leverage in our suppliers. So, if you can't really make third-party audits more effective, because it's not up to you, it's an entire organization that you try to influence as a company, but you might not manage to. You have to look at alternatives that work for your company, and most companies out there, they have their and supplier, I would call them maybe producer or manufacturer, different names for different companies, but they also have their middle companies that they are working with. And that's what we call suppliers. So we leverage on our suppliers, and it really works for us. We have suppliers coming proactively and say, we have found child labor or forced labor, or hopefully they don't say that extreme cases, but they come and proactively report to us findings that they have had in their internal audits. We audit those suppliers to identify if their management systems of identifying child labor or other non-compliances are strong enough. We rate them, and according to the rating, we influence our collaboration with them. There is an external goal that we have published, and it says that 80% of our buying volume is allocated to A and B suppliers. So if we are auditing our suppliers and we want to put 80% of our business volume to A and B suppliers, what is that message saying? It says that you have to have strong management systems when we audit you to be an A and B supplier for a positive collaboration. So they have to really have those strong management systems, follow up on child labor, follow up on cases, make sure to have internal audits. We review all of these things, and eventually we leverage through the suppliers, and it influences positively our supply chain.
Great. But I'd like to give the word to you, Mark, regarding some of the more practical aspects of this before we have to wrap up. It's already 4 o'clock.
I will be brief, and I think Eleni's just covered quite a few of the points, but yeah, so I think firstly, just to remind, I think one point is think about how you use the data, right? So, recognize the limitations of audits and think about what you need to do to supplement the good information you'll get from audits. So arguably, audits can be effective in assessing overall risk, giving you a sense of policies, management systems at suppliers, but as we've identified, they have limitations. So what can be done to make them more effective? I mean, we've identified clear differences between announced and unannounced audits. So that's certainly one thing to think about, and it's a really important difference. I think also looking as well at the kind of training and capability building that can be offered to the auditing community. So we ourselves offer, for example, training and to build the capability of auditors so they're more able to identify not just child cases, but the risk factors for child labour. Because I think that what's lacking in some approaches is linking risk issues together. So looking at issues around gender, forced labour, looking at how patterns of migration, be those internal or foreign migration patterns, are impacting on risk at a supplier, a factory or farm. So I think getting better at kind of looking at recognising risk factors, using grievance data more effectively alongside audit data, training capability building, also unannounced inspections if possible, I would say are the key things to think about. It is, I mean, the second part of the question I can see on screen, it's a really important one because we are seeing more efforts to reduce audit fatigue and more data sharing. Now, of course, in one sense, that's great, but alongside that, we do see dips in transparency in terms of severe risk. So there are some of the areas I would suggest that we should look at to address that.
To launch.
Can I add one more point before we go to the end as well? Because obviously, like Eleni and Mark are talking about very, very sort of practically day-to-day and operational great tips, which are very useful for actors working in this space to understand. But I also just want to add on a more softer advice. It's also sort of creating a system of trust, because when we talk about child labor, it's a highly stigmatized issue. We see it as one of the greatest breaches of our code of conduct and our policies, etc. And I think if you want to what Mark was saying also, and what Elena was talking about, like if you want to have your supply chain working for you in these issues, you want to sort of create a system of trust where you can actually, have others identify cases of child labor for you, and then you can work on support with those children and families to have them getting back to where they're supposed to be. And then we need to promote a more open discussion about child labor, I think, where you're allowed to identify children in child labor so that we're not seeing them hidden in the shadows or pushed to other tiers, lower down, farther out in creating bigger child labor risk, so to speak. So I think there is some learning in that as well, that we can create a more honest discussion on these issues together with those that we're working with to promote that transparency coming from others as well, I think. Just last addition from me as well.
Yes, it's a great addition. With those last words, I'm afraid we have to round up this session. We've already gone a couple of minutes past our ending time. So again, I'd like to thank Mark, Claus, and Eleni for joining us here today for this very important discussion. as we said at the start, we'll be sending out the presentation to all of you. And those of you interested to join in this work, please don't hesitate to contact us at ETI Sweden or to sign up to our newsletter or follow us on LinkedIn to get news on upcoming events on this and other global supply chain topics. So again, thanks a lot, Mark, Claus, and Elena for a very informative and interesting hour on child rights and child labor. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.